Okay, so you want to own an oil refinery. Towering steel columns wrapped in pipes, flare stacks burning against a night sky, tanker trucks lined up at the gate, and a business that turns a barrel of crude oil worth $70 into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel worth considerably more. You picture yourself controlling one of the most essential pieces of industrial infrastructure in the country, a facility so critical that entire regions depend on it just to keep their cars running and their planes flying. That's the picture. Here's what's actually going on inside that fence line: a business with some of the highest fixed costs of any industry in America. A single piece of equipment failure that can shut down a billion-dollar facility overnight. And a profit margin so thin and so violently unpredictable that refiners have a name for the number that actually determines whether they make money or lose it. And it has almost nothing to do with the price of gasoline at the pump. Refining is one of the strangest businesses in the entire energy sector, because unlike an oil producer, you don't even get to benefit when crude oil prices rise. In fact, rising crude prices can hurt you just as easily as they help you. Some refineries print extraordinary profits during certain windows of the year. Some quietly bleed cash for months at a time while the exact same plant runs at full capacity. And some get shut down permanently, not because they were poorly run, but because the fundamental economics of where they sit and what they process stopped working. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why this industry behaves nothing like the simple story of buying crude cheap and selling gasoline dear. What a refinery actually is before the money makes sense. You need to understand what actually happens inside one of these facilities. Because a refinery is not a single machine, it's an enormous, interconnected chemical processing complex built around one core idea: crude oil, a mixture of thousands of different hydrocarbon molecules. And a refinery's entire job is to separate that mixture and then rearrange the pieces into the specific products the market actually wants. The process starts at the crude distillation unit, where oil is heated to extreme temperatures and separated by boiling point into different fractions. Light gases at the top, gasoline range molecules next, then diesel and jet fuel, then heavier fuel oils, and finally the thick, tar-like residue at the bottom that nobody wants because it's worth almost nothing on its own. Here's the fundamental problem that defines the entire economics of this industry. The natural mixture that comes out of the ground does not match what the market actually demands. Crude oil naturally yields too much of the heavy, low-value stuff and not enough of the light, high-value stuff like gasoline and diesel. So refineries build enormously expensive secondary units specifically to fix that mismatch. A fluid catalytic cracker breaks large, heavy molecules into smaller, more valuable ones. A hydrocracker does something similar using hydrogen under intense pressure. A coker takes the worst, heaviest residue and essentially cooks it down into lighter products plus a solid carbon byproduct called petroleum coke. Each of these secondary units is itself a colossal capital investment, and the complexity of a refinery, meaning how many of these secondary conversion units it has, is measured by something called the Nelson Complexity Index. A simple refinery with just a distillation unit might score a 2 or 3. A highly complex refinery bristling with crackers, cokers, and hydrotreaters can score 15 or higher. This single number explains more about a refinery's profitability than almost anything else, because complexity is what lets a refinery take cheap, heavy, low-quality crude oil and convert it into expensive, light, high-quality products, capturing a bigger margin in the process. A simple refinery is stuck buying more expensive light crude and making relatively simple products. A complex refinery can buy the cheapest, ugliest crude on the market and still produce premium gasoline, an advantage that becomes enormous during certain market conditions and nearly irrelevant during others. The cost of building the thing nobody builds a new grassroots refinery in the United States anymore. And once you understand the price tag, you'll understand why. According to data tracked by the U.S. Energy Information Administration and industry engineering cost estimators, building a new refinery from scratch with a capacity of around 200,000 barrels per day A mid-sized facility by industry standards can cost anywhere from $8 billion to $15 billion depending on complexity, location, and environmental permitting requirements, and highly complex facilities with extensive secondary conversion units can push well past $20 billion. Break that down, and land and site preparation, while significant, is actually one of the smaller line items, typically representing 3 to 5% of total project cost, because a refinery needs hundreds of acres for tank farms, processing units, and the substantial buffer zones required by safety regulations. The processing units themselves, the distillation towers, the crackers, the hydrotreaters, the piping systems that connect everything, consume the largest share of the budget, often 60 to 70% of total costs. Environmental control systems, the equipment required to control sulfur emissions, treat wastewater, and meet air quality standards, have become an increasingly large cost center, sometimes representing 15 to 20% of total project cost on a modern facility built to current regulatory standards. And then there's the part that surprises people who haven't built major industrial infrastructure before. Permitting and environmental review alone can take 5 to 10 years before a single piece of steel goes into the ground, and that's assuming the project survives the process at all. Since community opposition and environmental litigation have killed proposed refinery projects in the United States even after years of planning and hundreds of millions of dollars in preliminary investment, this is the single biggest reason the American refining industry looks the way it does today. No new grassroots refinery has been built in the United States since 1977. Every barrel of refining capacity operating in America today exists inside a facility that is decades old, has been expanded, modified, and retrofitted dozens of times, and represents an accumulated capital investment that would be effectively impossible to replicate at today's construction costs and regulatory environment. This is also exactly why existing refineries, even old, unglamorous ones, carry enormous value simply by virtue of already existing. Buying an existing facility instead of the impossibility of building new capacity. Virtually everyone who enters this business today buys an existing refinery, and the market for these transactions reveals just how much variation exists even among facilities that look similar from the outside. A smaller, simpler refinery processing 50,000 to 100,000 barrels per day with limited secondary conversion capability might trade for $500 million to $2 billion, depending on its location, its complexity, and how well it's positioned relative to its regional crude oil supply and its product markets. A large, highly complex refinery capable of processing over 300,000 barrels per day with extensive cracking and coking capacity, positioned near major crude supply infrastructure and premium product markets, can trade for $5 billion to $10 billion or more. Here is the detail that catches people who assume they're simply buying steel and concrete. You're also buying the facility's specific crude oil supply relationships and its product distribution contracts, both of which are often more valuable than the physical plant itself. A refinery built and optimized for a specific type of crude oil, say, heavy, sour crude from a particular region, cannot simply switch to processing a different type of crude without either accepting a meaningfully lower yield of valuable products or spending hundreds of millions of dollars retrofitting the plant's processing units. This means when you buy a refinery, you're also inheriting and betting on the long-term availability and pricing of a very specific type of crude oil from a very specific set of suppliers. A bet that can go badly wrong if that particular crude oil source becomes more expensive, more difficult to access, or simply runs into geopolitical trouble. You're also buying existing environmental liabilities, and this is one of the most underappreciated risks in the entire transaction. Refineries that have operated for 50 or more years frequently carry decades of accumulated soil and groundwater contamination, and remediation obligations for legacy contamination can run into the hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes triggered years after a purchase closes when contamination that wasn't fully understood at the time of sale is discovered during a subsequent expansion or sale process. The number that actually runs this business years where refining economics stops resembling any normal business and becomes genuinely strange. And understanding this single concept explains almost everything else in this industry. A refiner does not profit from the price of crude oil, and a refiner does not profit from the price of gasoline. A refiner profits from the difference between the two, a number the industry calls the crack spread. The name comes from cracking crude oil into its refined products, and it represents the gross margin a refiner earns for the entire conversion process, before accounting for any of the refinery's own operating costs. A commonly quoted benchmark is the 3-2-1 crack spread, which models the approximate output of a typical refinery, 3 barrels of crude oil in, yielding 2 barrels of gasoline and 1 barrel of diesel out, and it's calculated as the market price of that gasoline and diesel output minus the cost of the 3 barrels of crude oil that went in. This crack spread can swing wildly, and it swings independently of what crude oil itself is doing. In a genuinely strong environment, the 3-2-1 crack spread can exceed $30 to $40 per barrel, an extraordinarily profitable environment for refiners. During weak periods, it can compress to $5 to $10 per barrel, barely covering operating costs, or worse. And here's the part that trips up people who assume rising oil prices are automatically good for refiners. If crude oil prices spike suddenly and gasoline prices haven't caught up yet, because retail gas station pricing tends to adjust more slowly than wholesale crude pricing, the crack spread can actually compress even while crude prices are rising, meaning a refiner can be losing money on every barrel processed during exactly the moment the evening news is reporting that oil companies must be making a fortune. Refiners are, in a very real sense, not in the business of predicting oil prices at all. They're in the business of predicting and managing the spread between two different, only loosely correlated markets, crude oil on one side and refined products on the other. And that spread is influenced by an entirely separate set of forces: refined product inventory levels, seasonal demand patterns, competing refinery outages elsewhere in the world that suddenly tighten product supply, and regional pipeline and shipping constraints that determine whether a particular refinery's products can even reach the markets willing to pay the most for them, the bills that never stop arriving here. Where the structural reality of this business becomes brutal in its own particular way. Unlike a business that can scale down when demand softens, a refinery is an enormously expensive piece of infrastructure that has to run close to full capacity almost constantly just to be economically viable at all, because so much of its cost structure is fixed regardless of output. According to industry benchmarking data compiled by Solomon Associates, a firm that has tracked refinery operating costs and performance benchmarks for decades, cash operating costs for a typical complex refinery run somewhere between $3 and $8 per barrel processed, depending heavily on the facility's complexity, its energy efficiency, and its regional labor and utility costs. Break that down, and energy is consistently one of the largest single cost categories, because refining is an intensely energy-hungry process. Heating crude oil to hundreds of degrees, running massive compressors and pumps, and powering the electricity-hungry secondary conversion units all require enormous amounts of natural gas and electricity. And a large complex refinery can consume as much energy as a small city. Labor is the second major cost, and it is specialized, expensive labor. Refineries require process operators trained specifically on that facility's unique configuration, instrumentation technicians, and highly skilled maintenance crews capable of working on equipment operating at extreme temperatures and pressures with hazardous materials. And a large refinery can directly employ several hundred to over 1,000 workers, many represented by unions with structured wage scales that have risen steadily. Maintenance is where the truly staggering numbers show up. Refineries operate on a strict cycle of planned shutdowns called turnarounds, where a specific processing unit, or, in some cases, the entire facility, is taken offline for weeks at a time for comprehensive inspection, repair, and replacement of critical equipment. A major turnaround on a large refinery can cost $50 million to $150 million or more for a single event. And these events happen on a cycle of roughly every 3 to 5 years per major unit, meaning a large, complex refinery is essentially always either in a turnaround, preparing for one, or recovering from one somewhere across its various processing units. And every single day that a unit sits in turnaround, it is producing zero revenue while still requiring the specialized contract labor, often thousands of additional temporary workers brought in specifically for the event, needed to complete the work within the tightly scheduled window. Because every additional day a turnaround runs long a day of lost production that can cost millions of dollars. Unplanned outages are worse. When a critical piece of equipment fails unexpectedly, a compressor, a furnace, a critical valve, the resulting unplanned shutdown doesn't just cost repair money. It can cost tens of millions of dollars in lost production during exactly the kind of tight product market where that capacity would have been most valuable. And it can also trigger significant regulatory scrutiny and potential fines if the failure resulted in any kind of emissions release. The regulatory weighta. Refinery is one of the most heavily regulated pieces of industrial infrastructure a private company can own, and the compliance burden is not a minor add-on cost. It's a fundamental and permanent part of the business model. The Environmental Protection Agency regulates air emissions, water discharge, and hazardous waste handling at refineries under multiple overlapping federal statutes, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration maintains a specific and unusually stringent standard called Process Safety Management, specifically because refinery accidents have historically been catastrophic, involving fires, explosions, and toxic releases that can kill workers and, in the worst cases, nearby residents. Refineries are required to maintain extensive documentation, conduct regular process hazard analyses, and undergo periodic inspections that can result in significant fines and, in serious cases, forced shutdowns if violations are found. On top of direct environmental compliance costs, American refiners operate under a federal regulatory program called the Renewable Fuel Standard, which requires refiners to blend a certain percentage of renewable fuels like ethanol into their gasoline and diesel output, or alternatively purchase credits called Renewable Identification Numbers, RINs, from other companies who have blended more renewable fuel than required. The price of these RIN credits can be genuinely volatile and can add a meaningful, unpredictable cost to a refiner's bottom line during periods when RIN prices spike, sometimes adding tens of millions of dollars in additional annual compliance cost for a single mid-sized refinery, depending on market conditions in a given year. Some states impose additional low-carbon fuel standards on top of the federal requirements, California's program being the most stringent and closely watched example, adding yet another layer of compliance cost and complexity that varies significantly depending on which states a refiner's products are ultimately sold into. None of this compliance apparatus is optional, and none of it scales down when a refinery is having a financially difficult quarter. The environmental and safety obligations exist at essentially the same cost whether the crack spread is $40 a barrel or $5 a barrel, which is exactly the kind of fixed cost against volatile revenue structure that has appeared again and again across every serious capital-intensive business, where location determines almost everything if you strip away every other variable. The single most important factor in whether a refinery is profitable is where it sits relative to two things: where its crude oil comes from, and where its finished products can be sold. Gulf Coast refineries, concentrated heavily around Houston and Louisiana, benefit from proximity to substantial domestic crude production, extensive pipeline infrastructure, and deep water ports that allow both imports of crude and exports of refined products to international markets, making this region the most competitively positioned refining hub in the country. West Coast refineries operate in a genuinely isolated market, because California in particular has limited pipeline connectivity to the rest of the country's refining and crude supply infrastructure, meaning West Coast refiners depend heavily on crude oil arriving by tanker ship and often produce a specialized, cleaner-burning fuel blend required specifically by California's stringent air quality regulations, a product that other refineries in the country generally don't make, which paradoxically insulates West Coast refiners from some outside competition, but also means any disruption to a West Coast refinery can cause sharp, localized price spikes because there's limited ability to quickly ship in replacement supply from elsewhere. Midwest refineries benefit from direct pipeline access to Canadian crude oil, historically priced at a meaningful discount to other global crude benchmarks, giving well-positioned Midwest refiners a genuine structural cost advantage in their crude oil input costs compared to refiners without that same pipeline access. East Coast refining capacity, by contrast, has shrunk dramatically over the past 2 decades, because East Coast refineries generally lack direct pipeline access to cheap domestic crude, historically depended on imported crude oil at global market pricing, and have struggled to compete economically against Gulf Coast facilities that enjoy meaningfully cheaper crude input costs, a structural disadvantage that has driven the permanent closure and conversion of several East Coast refineries over the past 15 years. This is the same lesson that showed up with land in the ranch and vineyard economics. Just wearing an industrial infrastructure costume, the physical asset matters less than its position relative to the supply chain and the market it serves, and a refinery in the wrong location, even if it is mechanically identical to a refinery in the right location, can be a permanently disadvantaged, marginal asset for its entire operating life. The real case study. Philadelphia Energy Solutions don't understand how catastrophically this business can fail then at a facility with real historical importance. Look at what happened to the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery, once the largest and oldest refining complex on the East Coast, tracing its roots back over 150 years. The facility had struggled financially for years due to the structural East Coast disadvantage described above, competing against Gulf Coast refiners with meaningfully cheaper crude access, and it had already filed for bankruptcy once before, emerging under new ownership backed by private equity investment specifically betting that the plant could be turned around. On June 21, 2019, a corroded pipe elbow in an aging alkylation unit failed catastrophically, releasing highly toxic hydrofluoric acid and triggering a massive explosion and fire that injured several workers and forced the evacuation of nearby neighborhoods. Investigators later found that the specific pipe segment that failed contained visibly reduced wall thickness from years of corrosion that had gone undetected, a direct consequence of deferred maintenance investment on aging infrastructure that the financially struggling company had been unable or unwilling to fully fund. The explosion was severe enough that debris was found in a residential neighborhood outside the refinery's boundary, and the incident caused an estimated $750 million in property damage to the facility itself. Within a month of the explosion, the company filed for bankruptcy for a second time, and this time there was no turnaround. The refinery permanently shut down its processing operations, eliminating roughly 1,000 direct jobs in a facility that had operated continuously for well over a century, through multiple owners, multiple economic cycles, and to world wars. The site was ultimately sold not to another refiner, but to a real estate and logistics developer who is converting the sprawling 1,300-acre property into a mixed-use logistics and industrial park, a direct echo of exactly the pattern we've seen with ranches, hospitals, and shopping malls. When the underlying operating business becomes structurally unviable, the land itself, and its proximity to a major population center and transportation infrastructure, becomes worth more repurposed than it is worth continuing to operate as originally intended. The Philadelphia case is the clearest possible illustration of the core structural risk in refinery ownership. This is a business where a single piece of corroded pipe, a maintenance decision deferred to preserve cash during a difficult financial period, can end 150 years of operating history in a single afternoon, and where the underlying regional cost disadvantage that made maintenance investment feel unaffordable in the first place never actually went away. It just waited for the weakest link to fail. To scenarios, let's build the honest math the way an actual owner has to run it. In the good scenario, you operate a large, complex Gulf Coast refinery processing 300,000 barrels per day, well-positioned near abundant, discounted domestic crude supply and deepwater export infrastructure, a tight global product market, driven perhaps by unplanned refinery outages elsewhere in the world, or unusually strong seasonal driving demand, pushes the 3-2-1 crack spread to a strong $35 per barrel for an extended stretch. At 300,000 barrels per day, that crack spread alone represents roughly $10.5 million a day in gross margin before operating costs. Subtract cash operating costs of roughly $5 per barrel, another $1.5 million a day, and you're clearing something in the range of $9 million a day in operating profit during that strong window. An extraordinary business when conditions align. Across a full year, with generally favorable market conditions and no major unplanned outages, a facility like this can generate operating profit in the billions of dollars. Now the bad scenario. Global product demand softens as a mild recession reduces gasoline and diesel consumption. Simultaneously, several competing refineries elsewhere complete their own turnarounds and come back online at full capacity around the same time, adding supply into an already softening market. The 3-2-1 crack spread compresses to $6 per barrel, barely above your cash operating costs per barrel. At that thin a margin, the same 300,000 barrel per day facility is generating only marginal profit, or in a genuinely severe compression, an outright operating loss, even while running at full physical capacity and employing the exact same workforce as during the good year. And then, during this exact stretch of thin margins, a scheduled turnaround comes due on your largest processing unit, a planned $80 million maintenance event that has to happen regardless of current market conditions because deferring it risks the exact kind of catastrophic equipment failure that ended the Philadelphia refinery permanently. The difference between these 2 years on the exact same physical facility, with the exact same workforce and the exact same crude oil supply contracts, can be the difference between near-record annual profit and a genuine operating loss, and that entire swing is driven by a crack spread that the refiner does not control and cannot reliably predict more than a few months in advance. The real payoff, the difference between refinery owners who survive across multiple decades and those who don't, isn't about being smarter at chemistry or better at negotiating crude oil supply contracts, because virtually every serious operator in this industry has access to broadly similar technical expertise. It comes down to 3 things: maintaining rigorous, well-funded maintenance discipline even during periods of thin margins, because deferred maintenance is a debt that eventually comes due catastrophically rather than gradually, holding enough financial reserve to absorb genuinely bad multi-quarter stretches of crack spread compression without being forced into the kind of desperate cost-cutting that led directly to Philadelphia's corroded pipe, and owning facilities positioned in genuinely advantaged locations relative to crude supply and product markets, because no amount of operational excellence fully overcomes a structural regional cost disadvantage over a long enough timeline. The refinery itself, unlike vineyard land or ranch land, doesn't meaningfully appreciate in value simply by existing. There's no equivalent of a slowly rising land price quietly building wealth in the background regardless of how the operating business performs in any given year. Every dollar of value in this business has to be earned through the volatile, cyclical grind of the crack spread, year after year, turnaround after turnaround, which is exactly why so much of the American refining industry has consolidated into the hands of a small number of large, well-capitalized operators capable of absorbing the bad years long enough to profit from the good ones. Which means the honest answer to whether owning a refinery can make you genuinely wealthy is yes, unambiguously, during the right market cycle at the right facility. But it is also one of the least forgiving businesses in industrial America for anyone without the balance sheet to survive the years. The crack spread simply refuses to cooperate. The romance of controlling critical energy infrastructure is real. The economics underneath it are a permanent, unblinking bet on a spread you don't control, running through a facility that punishes any deferred maintenance decision eventually, sometimes all at once, on an ordinary Friday afternoon in June. And subscribe.